It's a great pleasure to introduce Daniel Mitropolsky. So about 2 weeks ago, I got an email from Christos Papadimitriou that his brilliant postdoc is visiting this area and his interest in Brown. And for interest, I said, we'll be delighted to invite him to give a talk. And you actually did all the organization. And in his letter, Christos brags about Daniel. He's already some 2 big results under his belt. Clearly, Christos is not so generous unless it's really serious stuff. So I got very excited, and I can say a few words about Daniel. So he's a PhD student at Columbia, working with Christos and Tal Malkin. He's interested in computation mathematical theory of the brain, especially understanding the brain algorithm behind language and possible applications in AI. Both Christos and I are very big fans of John von Neumann. And by the way, Christos and Mihaly Simakai just got the John von Neumann Prize. And reading your abstract, one of my favorite books of von Neumann is The Computer and the Brain. And he has the ending sentences is not the language of mathematics, it's the language of the brain. So I think Daniel is going to tell us what is the language of the brain.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here. I'm really excited to tell you about my main PhD work, which is about the simplest neural model and a hypothesis for language. So understanding the brain, understanding the basic computational logic or mechanism of the brain is really one of the greatest unsolved problems left in science, especially something in such plain sight. I mean, we all have brains. We've been studying them for millennia in various ways, but we don't understand the basic logic. So I think it's perhaps unique among basic scientific questions and how pertinent and obvious it is, yet how far we are from understanding. No one put this better than the Nobel laureate neurobiologist Richard Axel, who said, "We don't have a logic for the transformation of neuronal activity to thought and action. I consider discerning this logic as the foremost research direction in neuroscience." So a lot of people are working on this. And make this clearer, this means bridging the gap between two things. Between, on one hand, neuron biology, which we understand really well. We know a lot about the neuron cell. And we even know a lot about small neuronal circuits. Like for very simple animals, such as sea slugs, we've actually mapped out all the neurons in that animal and how they connect. And we understand those neural circuits pretty well. It's on the order of hundreds. Okay? But bridging that to animal and human intelligence, cognition, behavior, all of which are rich fields in their own right, language and linguistics. And we know that these phenomena compile down to neuron biology, but we don't understand how. So what's our approach as computer scientists, as people with expertise in TCS and math, those kinds of things? Well, I think I'll share with you a very interesting paper that sort of became a bit of a meme in neuroscience years ago, and it's called "Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor?" So what these authors tried to do is they said, what if you took a microprocessor, which is something, the logic of which we understand perfectly well. We understand how logical gates work. In fact, we can make it from scratch. And we collected data from it in a way similar to the way we collect data from brains. And we applied the same data analysis methods to that data. And their conclusion was that the answer is no. You really couldn't understand how it works. You could extract some patterns, some regularities, and they talk about that, but there's no way to actually figure out the basic logic of what's going on. So our approach as computer scientists, I think, should be, if you're interested in this problem, and it's a very fundamental one and one that's a very strong computational flavor, so I think computer scientists should be interested in this, is sort of in the opposite direction, from the bottom up, so to speak. So neuroscientists are mostly thinking about it from the top down. They have all this neuroscientific data, which there's always more, We have whole connectomes now of some animals and so on. And they're trying to look through the data and figure out the logic from the data. But what if we do something different? What if we just take the most basic principles that we know are true, the most basic facts from neuroscience that are true across the brain and across animals, and use those to directly construct computational models, really simple ones that we can then study through theorems about or simulate, and try coming from that direction. Now, that direction is also hard, right? We'll have to think about whether or not you can actually do cognitive algorithms that we know the brain does in those models. That means so studying both upper bounds but also lower bounds, which means, if we can say that something's not possible in that neural model, then it starts to yield a hypothesis that can be checked in the actual brain and so on. So eventually, through this direction, maybe we can actually come to predicting or modeling the data that we had in the first place. So this is our approach. So here's an overview of how this talk is going to go. I'm going to start by telling you about how we can come up with a very simple model of the brain. We'll do it together, and we'll define one. In fact, we'll define a family of models. But then we'll see that even this very simple model can do something surprising. And then we'll talk about how one could do language in this model, and I'll motivate why. It seems like quite a jump there. But maybe it's already motivated to you. But in a sentence, it's because language is the brain's greatest trick. Good, but let's start with thinking about how to create a very simple model of the brain. So how would you go about doing this? Again, we just want the simplest principles. We can't deal with all this data in neurobiological detail. Well, the simplest details are really these, that all of brain computation compiles down to firing neurons, and firing is an atomic operation. It's like a 1 or 0 thing, that there are excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So this is actually quite different from ANNs. In ANNs, a neuron can have positive and negative weights, but in the brain, a neuron has almost always all positive or all negative weights, okay? And that the main mechanism for learning or for change in the brain is local synaptic plasticity. That means a single synapse, a single edge, determines how to change itself based only on its own state, on its own weight. I was just talking about this with someone here, but this importantly means that something like backpropagation is entirely implausible biologically. That's probably one of the least controversial things I'll say in this talk, because backpropagation requires taking information from other layers, from other synapses. But a synapse can update itself based on its own weight only, and maybe at most the firing times of the neurons on each side. But certainly not, some delta from some other layer or something. Okay, so these are the basic ingredients we know are true in the brain. And the brain can compute with these, but possibly also one would need more ingredients. Okay, but to make a model out of this, we need to concretize and simplify even more. So let's do that. So for firing, we're going to assume discrete time. And at each time step, a neuron can either fire or not. Now, to computer science audiences, whenever I present this simplification, people are like, yes, of course, what else would you do? To neuroscience people, this is a pretty extreme assumption. It's not unheard of. Modelers do this, but people who are interested in pure neuroscience modeling, especially of the cell, often use real time. And there are various reasons for this. But the issue with that is, even if you have a model of neurons or neuronal circuits, it becomes very hard to simulate and to study. If you know about the field neuromorphic computing, what they're trying to do is basically come up with a whole new hardware, kind of like how quantum computing is trying to come up with a hardware for their model. There are people trying to come up with a hardware that can run real-time neural algorithms with like fake neurons or something like this. But it's very hard. Whereas with this assumption, we can actually simulate our model on standard hardware because standard hardware has a clock. Okay. Now I mentioned there are inhibitory neurons in the brain. There are various kinds of inhibition in the brain, but one of the most important and most ubiquitous, this is found throughout all of the brain, from cortex to interior regions, animal brains, is something called local inhibition. So we know that this is very, very important. Local inhibition means that there are inhibitory neurons firing across a small cytological or like actual anatomical small area locally, inhibiting all the neurons equally in that area, all the excitatory neurons. So to simplify, we'll start by modeling only that kind of inhibition, okay? And then plasticity, even for local plasticity, which means that the synapse changes depending only on the local state. There are many kinds of mechanisms, slow, fast, etc. But to simplify, let's start with the simplest kind of plasticity of all that we know happens in the brain, okay, which is Hebbian plasticity, which is nicely summarized by the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. Okay, so now let me define, based off just these principles, a very simple neural model, which we'll call NEMO for short. So in NEMO, an instance will be composed of some number of brain areas, which we'll label with capital letters, and each brain area has n neurons. So the number of areas you chose and the number n, which is the size of each area, these are parameters of an instance of NEMO. So when you want to run some experiment or study one setting or something for a theorem, like you'll choose these parameters. Then you initialize. You can think about this as like happening at birth or early development. You kind of initialize all of these areas as a Erdos-Renyi random graph. Every neuron to every neuron with a fixed probability p. That's another parameter of an instance. Okay. Now, a pair of areas, so two areas, may be randomly connected. So you choose your areas and you choose which areas are connected to which areas. And if two areas are connected, we'll just use the shorthand fiber. We'll say there's a fiber between them. Okay. And how do you connect them? The same way, Erdos-Renyi randomness. So you connect every neuron in the first area to every neuron in the other area with the same probability p. You could consider a version where these p's are different, and we might mention that later. And this is directional. Okay. Now, so far, if you've been following, then if you have a pair of areas that are both connected to each other, then nothing makes them distinct areas yet, because then so far everything is connected with probability p. So something will come in a second that will make areas actually distinct from one another. Good. Now for each synapse, let me just finish this. For each synapse that we sampled with probability p, we're going to pre-initialize it with weight equal to 1, just for the beginning. Yes?
Okay, sorry, I just didn't understand that last point you were making. Like, you can have like if you have two areas and they're connected internally, each of these are just like GNP, so they can have edges which are absent, right? Like,
yes,
it's not fully connected.
Yes.
Within each one. Okay.
That's not true. My point was just that if you have two areas like that and I have fibers both ways, then so far it's just one big Erdos-Renyi random graph. But it isn't, because we have the following ingredient, and this is where inhibition comes into play. So we have local inhibition of the following kind. At any time t, exactly k neurons in an area can fire. And k is something small, much smaller than n. For example, you might set it to square root of n. Sometimes we study log n. It depends. It's much smaller. Okay. And why is this local inhibition? So actually, in this model, we're not modeling any inhibitory neurons explicitly. We're only modeling them implicitly because their action is such that they maintain a threshold at all times such that only k neurons in an area can fire. They're making sure that only sort of k winners in an area are firing at a time, but we're not modeling them explicitly. Good. Now, I said fire. What is fire? Right, I didn't define that. That's the main operation of this model. So I'll define it to you now. Let's say you have two areas, A and B, and we fix some neurons that will fire in A. Some neurons, we'll call that set X. Just fix them for now, like an initial condition. So what does firing mean? For every neuron I in the area B, its input is just the sum of all the incoming synapses or edges from the neurons that fire. So each neuron can locally compute its input. This is like ANNs. Okay. But then we do the inhibition mechanism. The top k neurons in B, the top k inputs, win, which means that those will be the neurons that fire in B at the next time step. That's the rule. Okay. And importantly, in our model, this computation of all the inputs and selection of top k takes one time step in this model, because that's what the brain does. Right? And so here's one last ingredient of the model. This is where Hebbian plasticity comes in. Right? If a neuron J fired and immediately after a neuron I fires, we reward this synapse by scaling it by a number 1 plus beta, where beta is some non-negative constant. So that's another parameter of an instance, and it's just multiplicatively increasing the weight. And again, we're only explicitly modeling excitatory neurons. And this defines a dynamical system. you have to, in addition to the areas and connections, you have to choose some starting conditions, some neurons that fire at time 0. But then the system just evolves as a dynamical system. Okay. This model is extremely simple. Okay. One thing I should say, and I should have said this earlier, is that this talk is really aimed for a diverse audience. It's for computer scientists, but also neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. So I'm throwing in things that may be more of interest to one group or another. And also I may define terms that are super obvious to you, so bear with me. But especially to neuroscientists, this model seems like it's missing so much detail. It does capture very important points, but for example, one could have more sophisticated plasticity. Even Hebbian plasticity might be additive or might depend on some other increasing function beta of the weight, like one could have like an asymptote, for example. The model I defined to you has no weight renormalization, which in the brain is called homeostasis. But we know that this happens in the brain because forgetting happens. So we just don't have this now. We could have variable K. The fact that some sort of inhibition enforces exactly K neurons to fire is a very strong assumption. In fact, even in areas in the brain where we have observed this to happen, we know that sometimes when there's lots of input coming in, like just overwhelming input, K might jump to 2K temporarily or something like this. And also we're only modeling one kind of inhibition, but we know long-range inhibition exists, inhibition between areas. But the thing is, we actually do care about these other details. And sometimes we will study them. Sometimes we'll add them to NEMO and make like a NEMO 2 and 3 and so on. So really there's something of like a complexity theoretic zoo of NEMO models going on here. And we will see these again. In particular, we will look at NEMO with long-range inhibition at some point. But it suggests the following agenda, which is start with the simplest possible model, which is the one I started by defining for you, and see what it can and cannot do, and then maybe consider the more advanced ones and so on. Good. So I said to you in the beginning that we'll define a super simple model, and then I'll show you that it can do something surprising. So let me tell you what it can do that's surprising. So, well, the first thing it can do that's surprising. Okay. Assume we have two areas, A and B, and we fix K neurons in A. We fix them, that'll fire forever, or T equals 1 and so on. When we do this, we call it a stimulus. We sort of override the model and its dynamics for one area. We say only these K neurons will fire. Okay. At the first time step, those are the only neurons that were active. So they fire, which will create some neurons in B that'll fire next time. Right? Not create, it will summon some neurons. Some neurons in B will be selected to fire the next time step. And after that, these neurons keep firing, and the neurons in B are firing recurrently inside of B. Okay? The theorem is that surprisingly, this system converges to a single set of neurons that fire in B. A single set that will fire forever. Now, why is this surprising? This will also explain to you what this theorem means. Okay? So at time step T equals 1, only the fixed neurons in A fire. So who wins in B? It's a totally random set. Right? By symmetry, over the randomness of the initialization, any set of K neurons in B is equally likely to be this K set. Anyone. So some set, let's just call it Y1. But what happens at time step 2? Time step 2, the winners that win then have very little in common with Y1. Depending on the parameters, you get a different overlap, but sometimes there's almost no overlap. Okay, intuitively, why is this the case? Y1 are all the neurons that had the highest connections to the stimulus, right? And this is connected by Erdos-Renyi random graphs. So these are like heavy hitters of sampling edges. But at time step 2, you're also firing this set recurrently, Y1. And since areas are pretty big, okay, there are neurons out here which are decently connected to the stimulus, decently, not enough to be Y1. But they're very well connected to Y1 inside the area. So now these are the new winners. You see? So maybe you'll recycle some winners, but it'll be largely disjoint. Okay. But then as you keep going, time 3, 4, and so on, you start to recycle more and more old winners. Because every time you're doing this, you're sampling neurons, you're selecting the neurons in B that have high connection to previous winners and to the stimulus. You're like sampling neurons that have a lot of edges to what's fired before. So eventually you start to converge. And then you converge in a small number of time steps for most settings of parameters to a single set Y. So from then on, if you fire the stimulus in Y, you always get Y, again and again and again. Yes.
Sorry, I guess I have a follow-up question to my first question, which I think has been answered, but I just want to like make sure I'm understanding the model. I guess when you were first describing this and you were describing like when there's a fiber between two regions, what I understood is you like flip a single bias coin P, and if it comes up heads or whatever, then you like put every possible edge between A and B.
Every single edge of sample.
Okay. Good. So it's all GNP, which makes what you were saying before make more sense to me now.
I'm really glad it does. Yeah, no, the choice was whether to have a fiber at all.
Yeah, okay.
And if you chose no for your architecture, the architecture is an instance of the model. Like maybe you have two brain areas that just can't communicate at all. I don't know, like the point is you're allowed to have that in this model. Like in a Turing machine, you're allowed to choose what operations you have. Here, you're allowed to choose which areas are connected or not at all.
And that's not probabilistic.
No. Yeah. If they're connected, it's probabilistic. Yeah. Good. So you converge to this set. Okay. Now, what are some properties of this set Y? It has some very intriguing properties. The first one is that it's highly interconnected. The internal probability of an edge in this set is several times P, which is the ambient probability, I guess, in the area. So you can think of this as some sort of biological algorithm for finding approximate cliques, or like pseudo-cliques, highly dense subsets of a graph. And it's a very efficient one in this model of computation, which can do all the inputs and top K in one time step. But yes, so that's interesting. Okay, and also this set has stability properties. So it has the basic stability property I just showed you, which is if you fire the stimulus in the set, you always get the set, okay, forever. But you can actually make it even more stable. So if I kept firing the dynamical system for a few more time steps after it converged, so it converged, nothing's changing, but I keep firing, then I am kind of increasing the weights inside of Y even more, and the ones from the stimulus to Y. So it's becoming even stronger. So then I get even stronger stability, which I'll just mention. For example, if you erased who's the winners in B, you forgot, but you have to keep the synaptic weights. Those remember something, right? So you forget who the winners are, but you keep the weights of the graph the same. Then if you fire the stimulus just once, for one time step, you get Y right away in B. It like summons Y immediately. Or for example, if you forget A, just take B, and you fire Y recurrently only, you'll get Y again. So it's like a self-sustaining state of the system in B. We call a set with these properties an assembly. And it's no coincidence that assemblies, these dense and stable subsets of a graph, emerge from the simplest tenets of neural computation. I took really the simplest ingredients, and I ran the simplest algorithm, essentially, which is just letting the system fire, and I found these dense, stable subsets. Okay? This is very suggestive because in neuroscience, assemblies are increasingly believed to be the basic unit of cognition. Okay? In neuroscience, an assembly is basically the same thing. It's a large and densely interconnected set of neurons, of excitatory neurons, importantly, like ours, whose near simultaneous firing is tantamount to a subject's thinking about a memory, a concept, or a word, and so on. Okay, these were hypothesized by Hebb in the mid-19th century, and since then they've been studied, they've been observed in animals, and of course we can't confirm that they play this role in the brain, but it is a very convincing hypothesis of neural computation, and our model finds them naturally. So as we studied our model further, we took these dense sets, which you can get in this simple way, and tried to think about how to use them to do more and more computation. So what I just showed you, which is take a stimulus, or actually you could take an existing assembly and create an assembly in a downstream area. This is an operation, right? It should be thought about as like some sort of operation. And we call it projection. It's something like a variable copy or variable assignment a little bit, okay? And it turns out that many more operations are possible. So I'll mention a few. Let's say you have an existing assembly that you created the way we talked about, and you fire a small subset of the assembly, like let's say 40%. That breaks the model because I said K neurons fire in an area, right? But let's say I did it. Well, then in a few time steps, you'll get a whole assembly firing and just stuff. Okay? There's another very suggestive thing you can do. How about we do projection, but with two inputs coming in? So let's say you have two stimuli or two assemblies, X and Y, and you're firing them into a third area downstream, okay? Well, then also very quickly, you can create an assembly downstream, which we'll call XY, which is richly connected to both input assemblies. So if I fire either of these, I get that. Now here's even, I'll say something, sketch this, like if you introduced fibers in the backwards direction, if these were assemblies to begin with, then even if you're firing back from here, it's not going to destabilize these. Okay, these will remain assemblies, and it might take a bit more time, but you'll form an assembly here as well. And that one has an additional property, which is now I can go this way. So if I fire this assembly, XY, then at the next time step, it activates X in B and Y in C. So I can do an OR sort of, and I can also see the inputs. So when you see an operation like this, hopefully as computer scientists, you start to get the feeling like, okay, maybe this thing can actually compute. Like it seems to simulate like something like logical gates and so on. There are many more operations, which I'll just mention briefly. For those that know about these, like we can do association of concepts, disassociation, so we can take two overlapping assemblies and project them to a huge area, and then they will be disjoint. We can memorize sequences and other things like this. Okay? And we prove, in fact, that the NeMo model, with an addition, which I'll mention, is in fact Turing complete, which means that in principle, it can simulate any arbitrary computation. The statement is something like this, that if the Turing machine uses S space and T time, then you can simulate it in approximately polylog S times T time and space, where space is the size of areas. Okay. And this also uses a version of NeMo with long range inhibition, which I haven't defined exactly. I'll define it later because it'll come back, but roughly speaking, it means that there are some neurons which you can plant, just like the instructions to a Turing machine. You can plant neurons which can inhibit an entire area. So a neuron firing will silence another area. Now that's a very strong assumption. It actually allows you to do a lot more. We don't know how to prove this without the LRIs, okay? But it's used in a limited way. But the question is, all right, if this model is Turing complete, does it mean we're done? In fact, I'm always kind of a little bit hesitant how to present this to computer scientists. On one hand, I mean, this is a positive result, right? It tells us that these very basic tenets of how the brain computes, if abstracted in the right way, can handle arbitrary computation. But I don't think it means we're done. And let me try to motivate this. Okay. So first of all, the algorithm for simulating a Turing machine is wildly implausible biologically. If you're actually interested in studying and modeling the brain, in cognitive science, then like this isn't satisfying. It's just the brain doesn't work this way. Sometimes I like to joke that maybe when you're imagining a Turing machine in your head, maybe it's doing this algorithm, but that's like the one case, okay? And it's also wildly inefficient. Sure, it's polynomial time, but for tasks that humans are good at, if you implemented the algorithm in NeMo using this reduction, you would get like approximately squared the time and space complexity for many things, right? So it's very inefficient. So this is hard to motivate, but like so what do we want to do? We want to study algorithms in this model that are efficient. Efficient means at least better than what you get through the Turing machine reduction. Because efficiency means that you're actually exploiting the computational power of this model. For example, we know the model can find approximate cliques efficiently. So clearly it's like different, very different from a Turing machine. But any algorithm that does better than this must be exploiting the logic of the brain, if you believe this is a model of the brain, okay? And biological plausibility, on the other hand, is harder to define. It's something that our understanding of it has changed with this project. It's inherently hard to define, but if things like which areas you used and their fibers, the size of areas and the other parameters being cognitively realistic, like close to the brain, maybe the actual execution of the algorithm corresponds to what we know from brain studies about how the brain is doing these things. All of those things would give more evidence that this specific algorithm that you constructed in NeMo is in fact biologically plausible. It constitutes a hypothesis for what the brain is doing. So to summarize, this kind of suggests the following research program. I'll call it a fine-grained complexity of NeMo models. We care about the exact time and space of these algorithms in NeMo, and we care about their biological plausibility. Yes.
I just have like one of many clarificatory points.
Yes.
This point about finding like approximate cliques, I guess like my first question is it only the case that you're able to efficiently find approximate cliques in random graphs whose P's also happen to be the P's that define these networks? Or is there some sense in which I can feed as input some encoding of a graph to one of these things, and then given just, you know, a P that we don't get to control, it goes and finds like approximate cliques in that graph? Like, I guess these two very computationally different problems.
Yes, that's a good question. I know how to prove it when the randomness is uniform.
Okay.
And I think there were results for other randomness models as well. Like you can use a different randomness model. I could tell you more about that offline. Okay. I know of one like that. But if it's an arbitrary graph,
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, the convergence might be very, very slow. So like the algorithm actually works if you don't have a stimulus at all. All you need is the plasticity. If you don't have plasticity, it doesn't work. You can take like a graph, choose a random set to start, which is the same with the stimulus, and just let it fire, and eventually you find a dense subgraph.
Okay.
So I think it may work in many other models of connectivity.
Okay. But you are assuming here that the graph that you're interested in is also the graph which is modeling the model of computation. Right?
Yes. Okay. I think that's true. Good. Any other questions before we move on? So far I've shown you, we've defined a model, we've thought about how we come up with a simple model of the brain, and we've looked at some theory regarding it. Okay. So before we go to the next section, let me tell you about who I work with, because we're going to change topics to language. So of course I work with my advisor, Christos Papadimitriou, and another very important member of our group is Santosh Mapala, a theorist at Georgia Tech. His student, Max Dabagia, Michael Collins, a computational linguist who's at Google now. And very recently, we've also been working with a very interesting team at Google Research, Srini Narayanan and Yulia Komsha, who are actually neuroscientists by training, or cognitive scientists turned Google researchers. So we also collaborate with others. You know, we meet with neuroscientists and linguists. This is the core team. Good. Oops, typo here. Sorry, I just changed this, and okay, that should say parser. But anyways. The next part of the talk is, can NeMo do language? So why would we want to study language? On one hand, because I love language, and so does Christos. It's really a passion of ours. But the other reason is, I just told you that this model is technically Turing complete, but it's very important to study actual, in a fine-grained way, algorithms for problems that we know the brain solves, and we know the brain solves efficiently. Okay? And sort of the most interesting one that brains can do, and in my opinion, the hardest thing brains can do, is language. If somebody came to me with a proposal for an abstraction of the brain, they said, here's a model that I think captures how the brain computes. My first question would be, well, how do you implement language? You know, we know it's something brains are good at, in fact, evolved naturally, co-evolved with humans. So it's very important to understand how language works in the brain. And it could be like the right problem to study, which would yield hypotheses and like things we can check, like maybe lower bounds, that it would require this much resources in the NeMo model, which could be used to confirm or deny the NeMo model or its variance, right? So we decided to start with language. And the first question we asked is, can we build a parser in NeMo? Okay. Now, if you're not really familiar with parsing, as I give an example, you'll kind of understand what we're doing here. But we're going to construct the syntactic tree from a sentence. And for those that know parsing in the audience, we're going to do dependency parsing. And again, we would like this to be an efficient algorithm, which means not what you get by going through the Turing machine. And as much as possible for it to be biologically plausible, roughly in line with what we know about language in the brain. And what we are able to do is parse in time that's roughly linear in the length of the sentence in the NeMo with LRIs model. So again, we'll need these LRIs, which I'll define a bit more in a second, okay? And again, what does parsing really mean? It assumes a setting where we already learned the language. So we're not solving a learning problem yet. So we're assuming that this is the adult brain that already knows the language and its grammar, and we're gonna see how it parses, okay? Now, what are these LRIs? These are single neurons. Equivalently, you could model it as a group of neurons, it's not very important, whose firing can inhibit or disinhibit entire areas, silence them, on or off. But here, it can do that, or it can inhibit or disinhibit a fiber, a connection between two areas. Okay. Now, this will become clear when I give you an example of the parser's execution, okay? So what does it look like? In this parser, we have a bunch of areas, verb, subject, object, determinant, and so on, that correspond to syntactic roles in a sentence, okay? Syntactic roles, we'll mention more about that in a second. For those that know dependency parsing, these are the dependency parse tags of a dependency parse. Okay? And these correspond to subsections of Wernicke's areas or other parts of the syntactic part of the brain that like compute the syntactic role of actors that you hear in a sentence, so on. And we have a very special area called lex. Okay? Lex contains a fixed assembly, xw, for every word w. So this is what I mean by this being the adult brain. Language is learned. And we plant these assemblies. You could create them in simulation using the projection operation that I showed you. You just make a few hundred or however many you want for your subset of English or whatever language. You make these assemblies in Lex. Okay? And you do a little bit more planting. Lex contains a fixed assembly for each word, and each of these assemblies is going to contain LRIs that will inhibit or disinhibit other areas and fibers. And these LRIs are the grammar of the system. And again, we've assumed that they've been learned somehow, so they're planted in the assemblies, these specific neurons, okay? And once you have this, it's very easy to parse a sentence. Here's the most both plausible and simplistic algorithm you can think of. Given a sentence, W1 to WM, for every word, you simply fire the word assembly WI in Lex for a fixed number of time steps until the system converges. In general, it's a very short number of time steps, like 10 to 20 time steps for most parameters. Okay. So let me show you what this really does. Let me actually show you what this does with an example. So we're going to do the sentence, the cat ran. So here's our organ. And its initial state is also something that is depends on the language. So this is the initial state for someone who knows English. Okay. In the initial state for someone who knows English, everything is inhibited except for subject, lex, and verb. And good, so determinant, for anyone who doesn't know, are words that come before nouns in English like the, and, any, some, which are generally obligatory in English except for plural nouns. So this is the starting state. So what happens when we hear the word the? So the assembly fires, and the has LRIs, so now you'll see what they do, which disinhibit the area det, so this whole thing is on now, and disinhibits the fiber from lex to determinant. So when you let the system fire for 10 steps, very quickly you summon an assembly indeterminate by the method I showed you before. In fact, if you're running many sentences, the fires into determinant so often that there's like something here ready to fire. So as soon as you do that, like you're converged right away, basically. Okay, not that interesting yet. Here it starts to get more interesting. So next we hear the word cat. Cat is a noun, so it has the following LRIs. These are the same, by the way, for all nouns of this type. So the LRIs can actually be shared by all assemblies of the same grammatical type. If that interests you, that's an important thing to linguists. But anyways, so what does the LRIs of cat do? They disinhibit the following fibers, the ones from lex to subject into object, and from determinant to subject into object. But at this state of the machine, object is inhibited. So this is what happens. Firing occurs between these three areas, and an assembly is formed in subj, which is richly connected to the word for cat, so you could read out cat somehow. But also, this assembly is the merge of this and this assembly, the one in determinant. So by going, like if you fired from here to here to here, like if you erase this and fire from here to here to here, you could get back the. It's like temporarily remembered that it's connected to the. So this assembly doesn't just represent cat, it represents the cat. So it's actually a noun phrase. Okay. And then when we see the word ran is a intransitive verb in this subset of English. So it disinhibits the fiber from lex to verb and from verb to subject. So in the next time steps, you create an assembly in verb, which is connected to the word ran, but also to this subject assembly here. Good. So I claim that afterwards, you can read out the dependency parse tree from the synaptic weights encoded in this machine at this time. What you do is you start with the last firing assembly in verb, because verb is always the root of a sentence in dependency parsing in general in language. And the algorithm, like very roughly, is something like fire to all areas that this has a fiber to, and see if you get an assembly. Now, if you fire to object, you wouldn't get anything meaningful here because there was no connection ever made there. You would get nonsense detectably, so you know there's no connection. When you fire to subject, you get a stable assembly. So you know there's a dependency here. So the verb, which is ran, you can always read out the word by projecting to lex, right? The verb ran has a dependency to this noun, and this noun is cat. And then from firing from subject to all areas, you would get that it has a dependency to a determinant. And thereby you know that cat dominates the. And so you can read out a tree of the sentence this way. So that was a sketch, but to summarize, after parsing, the synaptic weights of a graph implicitly encode the sentence's grammatical structure. Okay. Now this parser could parse simple sentences, like the young couple in the next house saw the little white car of the main suspect quite clearly. Okay. And for reasonable settings of parameters, and we can talk about how you find those or what that means, but this in general takes something like 20 to 25 spikes. And so in our heuristic of mapping brain spikes in Nemo to time, this is like roughly half a second per word, which is pretty realistic. Now, after we did this, versions were made by students in other languages, Russian, Japanese, Chinese, and Hungarian. The point of this is to show you that it isn't somehow inherently limited to English. Even with languages with very different syntax, you just would play different LRIs, and you will have different areas too. Like you don't need determinant in Chinese or Japanese or Russian or Hungarian. But in other languages, you need something else. Okay. Now, as I said, this parser, the one I showed you, these sentences are very simple. And the reason they're so simple is because they're depth 0. There's no embedded or dependent structure, by which I mean something like, the man whom I know came yesterday. And in some sense, that is all the meat of language. That's actually the most interesting thing. So, but however, we have a different paper in which we do extend the parser and come up with an algorithm that handles dependency and embedding. And if there's extra time or offline, I'll tell you about that, because this actually led us to discover a new characterization of context-free languages. So I'm really excited about this, but out of time, I'll skip it for now. Okay. So this parser is, of course...
Just in one sentence, the new characterization.
The new characterization is that basically we abstracted the algorithm we found that works in Nemo. Basically, it's like you have a parser that goes forward, but it can mark a symbol that it's passed as a fallback symbol. And it has one extra operation at any point, which is fallback. And it falls back to the most recently marked symbol.
So it's in the Nemo language.
But this is, yeah, that's an abstraction of something that can be implemented in Nemo very easily. How do you do fallback in Nemo? Really easy. When you decide you want to fallback, you take the word wherever you are so far, that state, and you project it to a new area. So you need one new area to do this, which will like store the most recent fallback state. And then whenever you want to fall back, you fire to that area, get an assembly, and then you can restore the fallback state. Okay. Now, this parser does not represent, even with the dependency parsing, a huge advance in NLP. There are better parsers out there. And there are better parsers that are learned from data, unlike ours, where we planted the grammar. However, what you have to remember is that this is implemented in a biologically plausible model of the brain, right? It all compiles down to just neurons and synapses firing with very primitive operations. This is like a huge dynamical system with tens of millions of neurons and trillions of synapses all being computed using various tricks that we've developed to make this, to actually simulate this. And you just run it, and then when you're done, the information memorized in synaptic weights encodes the dependency tree. Good. Of course, the biggest question this leaves open is, where do these assemblies come from? Like, the fact that these assemblies exist is what allowed you to parse. Separate assemblies for each word, and they know what kind of word they are, a noun, a verb, or what. So this was indeed the biggest question that this left open, and we thought about this for a long time. Okay? And very recently, in recent months, we've made progress on thinking about how Nemo could learn word assemblies. So let's talk about that. What is the desired algorithm? Like, one challenge with studying these models is that the setting is also hard to define. Like, how do you model inputs? It's very different than like classical models of computing. So you have to think about, and if you're studying real problems, like cognitive problems, like those decisions can be very important and can sometimes like easily, like an algorithm might follow as soon as you define things the right way sometimes. So what we would want, the hardware of the model should look like a tabula rasa or a blank slate, have a few dozen brain areas, okay? Maybe like the ones we had for the parser. Maybe we'll need some extra ones. We'll see. And then the input to the system that's fed in are grounded shared attention sentences. So that means whole sentences, which at the same time as you hear the sentence, you experience in some way the semantic content of that sentence, okay? Learning can only happen that way. And the output of this algorithm should be that after a reasonable number of sentences, you get a mature language organ, which will in particular have something like lex, the one I showed you, which has representations for each word in your language. And this thing should be able to parse and generate. Okay, now we have to this is an enormous problem, really. There's just so many pieces to this. And we know the way humans learn language also changes with the stage of language that you're learning. So we're really going to focus on the first stage of learning language that happens before you're 2 years old, probably begins in gestation, which is learning the simplest nouns and verbs. We call them concrete nouns and action verbs. These are nouns and verbs that have really consistent experiential signatures. Like a dog always looks like a dog, and so actions that are very consistent and the brain easily recognizes them. And we'll assume that phonology is completely solved, which is a huge assumption. That's also an interesting problem. So how do we represent input in any meaningful way? We're going to have the following contextual areas, okay? And two of them are privileged. The privileged ones are motor and visual. Motor is going to contain an activation, an assembly, for the perception of any motor action. And we know that there are parts in the brain that do this, even for actions that you're not performing. Like if you see someone jumping, there's something called mirror neurons in the brain, which do something like imagine you jumping, or there's a neural signature corresponding to witnessing an action. So that's what motor will represent. Visual will have a stimulus for every static visual phenomenon, like the picture of a dog statically, or a cat, and so on. And then we can have any number of other contextual areas. So in our experiments, we vary the number of other areas, but they might represent other things, like the affect you feel towards what you're seeing, other auditory signals in the background that aren't language, and so on. Okay, so this is what the model looks like. I'm going to be giving you fully a demonstration by picture here. So here are those contextual areas I mentioned. We're going to have an area called phon, which will have fixed representations for the phonological form of each word. The sound, we don't learn it, we're just going to feed it in. But we have two completely blank slate areas. They're initialized per the Nemo rules, but nothing else, which are lex verb and lex noun. So we believe you actually you might be able to do this with one area. I can talk about that later, but the simplest and most efficient algorithm, you need two. And you need to assume some extra geometry here, which doesn't break Nemo. It's just a stronger set of assumptions to Nemo. You have to assume that lex verb is more strongly connected to motor. It has a big fiber here. And lex noun is strongly connected to visual. You can connect them the other way too, as long as it's less connected. If you don't connect them at all, it's even better. Okay? And both are connected to the other contextual areas. So how does this work? This is what makes this problem interesting. Okay? When you hear a sentence, the contextual representation, the experiential representation of that sentence has to fire throughout the whole sentence for every single word. But you feed the words through phon one by one. So for example, when we're going to do the sentence, let me see what the sentence is, the dog jumps. When you hear the dog jumps, you're experiencing the jumping reaction and seeing the dog and the other contextual things the whole time for the word the, for the word dog, and for the word jumps. Okay? And that has to be the case because a priori, you don't know the word order of the language, you don't know anything, right? For example, English could reverse dog and jumps. Jumps could mean dog, and dog means jumps. And this needs to be able to handle that as well. Okay. So let me show you what happens when you hear the noun, when you hear dog in this sentence. Well, at this time, the phonological code of dog is firing into lex, and so is the static visual image. Okay, what we do for each training sentence is we fire for just a few time steps, not as long as we usually do for projection, just a few. Okay. And you can actually intuitively understand, based off everything else I've told you, that an assembly is starting to form in lex noun, which is sort of the fusion of this phonological form and the visual representation, and maybe some other things. Yeah. And similarly, when you hear the verb jump, the phonological form of jump and the motor signature of jump start to kind of merge and create something in verb. So actually, it's not very surprising, though it's good and reassuring that we can show that stable assemblies eventually are formed for verbs in lex verb and for nouns in lex noun. But that would not be so surprising, right? That kind of follows from merge and these things working. But I tricked you. You've been following, right? When dog came, isn't there also firing into lex verb? What if dog is the verb? When I showed you the dog side, I removed the verb area, but it's there. So what's happening there? it's true that it's being fired into. When the word dog comes, it fires into Lex verb, but so does the motor signature at that moment. So by the rules of the dynamical system, you get some winners in Lex verb, some K neurons. Sure, and they're rewarded slightly by plasticity, by the plasticity rule. But very soon after, you hear the sentence, the dog stretches. So we need varied sentences here. And this time, the motor signature of stretching fires into verb, which summons a very different set of winners. So this is another time when the dynamics of Nemo come to save us. They make it the case that if you have varying motor inputs, basically varying verbs coming with the verb dog in different times, it destabilizes the formation of anything meaningful in Lex verb. You get like a non-assembly. So what does it mean to learn words? It means that we check that robust representations of words have been formed in the correct area after training. So that means you can, they're connected to fawn and the context areas. You could like fire from one to the other to summon them. But if you fired from fawn or the context to the wrong area, you would get a non-assembly. Now, each of these words is like a star of assemblies, right? You have the hub is the assembly in Lex noun or Lex verb. It's connected to like all these contexts and to the phonological form. And it's a dynamic star. Like if the contexts change over time or you add new ones, it can update and like change its connections and learn new associations. Okay. And generation is the other big test and requirement of this model. So what would generate mean? What would the test be? What we do is we present the system a completely new setting by lighting up the context areas with a new setting, it's a new scene it's never seen before. So for example, a cat chasing a dog, some sentence it hasn't seen. And then we let the dynamical system simply fire, and it should somehow like squeeze its inputs and end up outputting the words in the correct order. And our device can do this. However, I haven't mentioned at all how you would learn what order to output these in. Okay? And that's something else that we thought about, and we have an algorithm for learning very simple word orders that I can tell you more about later. So we do, once you have a model like this, you can do all sorts of experiments. Okay, you can see how many sentences you need to learn a varying lexicon size, and it's something like roughly linear in a number of words. And you have a real like language organ. You can play with it. For example, you could ask, what if we presented the model single words sometimes? So just the word cat with no motor thing at all, just the word cat and the picture of the cat. And that indeed, in regimes where you're only learning a few words at a time, can like greatly speed up learning. And so we have other like interesting little experiments like this. But to summarize, what have we constructed? Okay, we've constructed a plausible and reasonably efficient algorithm for a very crucial step of language acquisition. Now, of course, this is a tiny step, and we've just begun. But what's suggestive here is that we've yet to perceive fundamental limits to what this can do. Okay, but who knows? Maybe enhancements to NeMo will be needed. So actually, the learning algorithm I just showed you didn't use LRIs anywhere, unlike the parser. So that's interesting too. Okay. But the other way to see our work is that it's a brain-like model that supports an entirely new kind of learning, one that uses only Hebbian plasticity and no backpropagation. And this is important because we know that it's possible somehow for networks to learn with only local rules, with Hebbian rules. Because well, how do we know that? The proof is that the brain exists. Okay? And it's very unlikely that we missed backpropagation in the brain. So this is kind of showing that maybe something could be done. Now, Hebbian plasticity was people were interested in it historically, but it fell out of favor because people weren't able to make progress with it. This was decades ago. But what I think we've done is we've shown that with a few extra ingredients, okay, namely brain areas, and you can configure which are connected with which, the uniform randomness, and the K-cap, importantly, Hebbian plasticity actually can be useful. So is NeMo the missing link between neuron biology and cognitive science? I don't know. Time will tell. But this is our approach to solving this question. Now, I've made a few slides on the future. I'll just show you one that I think is most interesting to people here. We started a bit late, so I only have 51 minutes. So, there's a lot of future things we want to implement in language, which will really test the power of the model in many ways. Possible applications to AI, but I'll mention to the crowd here more about model fundamentals. So one thing I really want to embark on is a more systematic study of really simple problems in NeMo, particularly with an eye towards lower bounds. So we have this recent theorem, which is there exists a NeMo algorithm that learns any discrete conditional distribution, or a graphical model with 2 nodes, using 3 brain areas in NeMo. but it does not exist for two brain areas. The spoiler is because you can't learn XOR, which might remind you of some classical learning theory stuff. But this is the kind of thing we're talking about, and this is also interesting from a cogSci perspective, because it would mean that maybe in certain parts of the brain that do a certain task, we can test whether it has anatomically distinct areas in the way NEMO does or doesn't, and so on. Okay. We also need a more systematic study of the NEMO family of models, right? There's base NEMO, there's NEMO with LRIs, and then there's other versions with more biological detail. And my dream is to prove something like a neural Church-Turing thesis. This is even hard to define, okay? But the basic idea is to show that NEMO, or maybe NEMO with LRIs, is in some definable sense just as powerful as the other plausible extensions. Now, it's already Turing complete, so in some sense, that's done. But what I mean is, you can very efficiently simulate anything that those extensions can do, like maybe log time, I don't know. And why would this be so interesting and suggestive? Because it might mean that the primitives of the most basic model, are enough to account for the rest of the detail. The rest of the detail might help a bit, but these ingredients are the ones that really capture how the brain computes. Thank you.
I should first check if anyone's waiting outside. Yeah, probably. I'll ask you a question while you do that.
Yes, please.
So, I guess, as a model of computation, this whole thing is extremely parallel, and I guess I'm wondering if this should well, A, if you just thought about this aspect of it, but B, if we should count this as a point for or against it as modeling how we want to understand brains. I don't know.
For. I mean, the brain is massively parallel. All the neurons are doing their computation in parallel. That's one of the key ingredients of the brain, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in this sense, the brain seems very parallel. But as far as sort of the way that people reason about the world, at least in a conscious way, it feels very sequential. But I mean, I'm highly uneducated about these things.
No. I think you're actually right. So there's two different things that are the line between them isn't always clear, but there's more autonomous tasks or things our brain does subconsciously, issues of perception, but even something like language generation when we talk, it's generally not very effortful. And I think in those kinds of more autonomous systems, the parallelism is essential to how we're running those algorithms. But you're right, for other kinds of reasoning, or even when you focus on what you're going to say, then we're doing something much more sequential. Now, it doesn't mean that the pieces of those sequential operations, like creating a symbolic representation somewhere and linking it with another one, those could be, the way those are done could be exploiting parallelism. But in and of themselves, there's sequentiality to them. Well, for example, the algorithm for parsing that I showed you is still sequential. In fact, it doesn't work if you present all the words at the same time. So it couldn't do that. Ostensibly, maybe, I don't know, LLMs also take words one at a time, and I'm sure you could make a version that takes many at a time. Whereas our algorithm would break there. So NEMO is massively parallel, but to do interesting things, you need to use many areas. And each area has a variable, right? And as soon as you're using multiple areas, you can't always be doing things in parallel. Then you need to be sequential. Yeah. Very good question, though. Yeah. Another poem.
What's this one about?
This is one of my favorite poems, my favorite Japanese poem. It's by a female poet named Kaneko Misuzu from the 1890s. It's a very unique character. She wrote children's literature as well as poetry. This one's called The Little Bird, the Bell, and I. So I encourage you to look it up. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thanks. Thank you.